Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to talk a little bit about engine oil, but it's not what you think. I see these arguments on Facebook all the time between guys who are proponents of natural oils or synthetic oils, particular brands of oils, and so on. These are arguments that can be almost religious in nature, and they're pointless to engage in with most guys because they're not going to be convinced anyway. What I want to talk about is oil sample analysis. If you've got a motor where you're trying to assess its health, or a motor that you're abusing and you want to keep tabs on the health, one of the best tools that you have at your disposal is an oil sample analysis. The engine oil is the component that you have access to which actually touches the rotating and reciprocating parts of the engine. So over time, as little bits wear off of those parts, it gets picked up in the oil and then thrown away when you change the oil. Don't just throw away the important data that oil contains. You can get an oil sample analysis kit, take a sample of the oil when you change it, send it to a lab, and get a very good look at what's going on inside your engine. For a new motor, oil sample analysis is a great tool to help you understand whether the motor is breaking in cleanly. For a motor like the one in my race car, which we're abusing, it's a great way to keep tabs on the internals of the motor and make sure that it's not in need of a rebuild before you expected it. And for a car that you may be having some difficulty with, it's a great way to rule out things like bearing wear. The lab that I always use here is Finning Caterpillar SOS Lab. So you buy these sample kits, they're a little bottle. You open them up, and inside there's a sterile bottle to catch some of your oil during your oil change. So you just take a little sample in the sterile bottle sort of midstream during the oil change. And there's some paperwork that you fill out. You pop that back in the return bottle. You put a label on top, which is included with the paperwork. And then in this case, I just drop this off at the Finning Caterpillar dealer, and in a couple of days they have the oil analyzed and they send a report to me by email. The Finning Caterpillar service costs something like $19 or $20. If you buy a kit of 10 samples, it's a little bit cheaper than if you buy them onesie twosie. I think if you buy them one at a time, they're $25 or something like that. But that's really inexpensive. You get a full metals workup, you get a viscosity workup, you get a glycol and water contamination workup, and you get an opinion from the lab on whether there are some problems with the motor that you might need to address. Now realize you won't have a Finning Cat dealership everywhere you are. In Western Canada, they're fairly ubiquitous, but what I suggest is look for any heavy equipment supplier, Caterpillar dealer, those kind of places, and that most of them are going to offer an oil sample analysis service. There are also some bigger labs in the US. My understanding is that some of these oil labs cost $100 a sample or something like that, but more than likely you're going to be able to find lab analysis tools through like a heavy equipment dealer, which will cost in that $20 a time range. That's a really, really inexpensive price for a full oil workup. And it is a great way to get a look at the internal health of your engine. So I've got a couple of lab analyses here. Let me go over a couple of the things on them and give you some idea on how you might interpret this. The kind of things that you're going to be looking at for bearing wear are lead and copper in the oil. So I'm looking at a sample right now. It has a lead content of 17 parts per million, a copper content of 13 parts per million. Finning flagged this as possible bearing wear, and in fact the motor was running cold due to a failed open thermostat, which wasn't doing it any good. When you're looking at the metals content of oils, you've got to think about what components are made of what in your engine. For instance, if you have an iron engine block and you have quite a bit of iron in your engine oil sample, it could indicate that you're getting cylinder bore wear. Same thing goes with aluminum. If you have an aluminum engine block and you have a lot of aluminum in the oil sample, that could indicate wear on the engine block. Likely your pistons are made out of aluminum. It's entirely possible that your rocker arms are made out of aluminum. So you need to start looking at these kind of components if you have a high aluminum content. Some of these components are not likely to come from your engine itself, but they're a component of the oil. For example, zinc. Engine break-in oils or oils that are suitable for flat tappet cams typically have relatively high zinc contents. So if you have a low zinc content, that oil may not be acceptable if you have a flat tappet cam or for break-in of a brand new engine. Tests like this finning analysis also include an indication of the water and glycol content of the oil. If you have a high glycol content, it can indicate a head gasket failure, maybe a crack in the block, those kind of things that are causing glycol to get into the oil pan. Sometimes you'll get a high water content on a motor which has got open breathers. That can be just condensation. But if you have a motor that's supposed to be sealed and you have a high water content, you need to be looking at what the sources of that might be. Could also be something like a coolant leak, head gasket leak, and so on. These tests will typically also include a viscosity test where they test the viscosity at two different temperatures, typically 40 and 100 degrees Celsius. And by doing this viscosity test and knowing what the original oil was, in this case you tell them it's a 1030 oil, for example, they can make a determination as to whether the oil has the correct viscosity for what it's supposed to. Now if it doesn't, that can indicate things like a fuel leak into the oil, wash down, a rich running scenario, and so on. If you have gasoline that's diluting the oil, then that viscosity test is going to show it. For a car like my race car that we're beaten up a lot, I sample the oil every change. Then over time, you begin to develop a history. And a lab like the finning lab will keep that history, and then when they produce a report, they'll produce a report with your last several tests on it. And it's easy for you to see if there are any trends. Like for instance, you have a certain amount of copper in the oil every test, and then all of a sudden that value shoots up. That's a red flag that you're starting to lose some bearings. And this can help you to do a rebuild or to stop before you end up with a calamity like punching out the block. Although that's not what this video is about, I'm sure some of you are going to ask, Matthew, what oil do you actually use? Well, as a general rule, I use Mobil 1 full synthetic. A full synthetic oil does not have heavy asphaltenes in it, and it will not sludge like a natural oil. It's perfectly safe for pretty well any motor, and it is true because their average molecules are a little bit smaller. If you've got a motor that's inherently leaky, the synthetic might find some of those leaks. Other than that, it's a great choice in my opinion. In my diesel pickup, I run a similar product called Delvac. That's a Mobil Imperial Oil product or Exxon product. Again, a full synthetic, and I generally run a 040 in my Power Stroke. It's cold here in the winter. It helps to promote starting, and it's not going to hurt at all in the summer. The long and short of it is you can get an incredible amount of data about the internal health of your engine from a $20 oil sample test. So why wouldn't you? Hey, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, hit that notification bell so that you won't miss out on future videos.